So this is the start of Unit 7, Quadratic Functions, and today we'll be solving quadratic equations by factoring. So we refreshed ourselves on factoring last week Thursday in class, and then we even got to the part of solving when we had problems that were already factored. So if you recall, we need to get it equal to 0. So for this first problem, we are going to subtract our 6x so that it is equal to 0. So now we have x squared minus 6x is equal to 0. Now we need to factor. Whenever we factor, we always look for our greatest common factor first, our GCF. So between the x squared and the 6x, our GCF is x. So that means we will take that x out, and we'll write down what we have remaining. So this is x, and then in parentheses we still have x minus 6, and then this is all still equal to 0. Now what we talked about on Thursday is when we have two things being multiplied together that give us 0, that means that one of those two things has to equal 0. So here we have x times x minus 6. So that means x should be 0 or x minus 6 should be 0. X minus 6 equals 0, continuing to solve that for x, we get x to equal 6. So then the two solutions for this first problem is 0 and 6. We will put those in our set builder brackets, our curly brackets, and we will write them from least to greatest. Second problem, 2x squared plus 7x equals 15. In order to solve these by factoring, it first must be equal to 0, and then we can factor what we have left. So to make this equation equal to 0, we will have to subtract the 15. So doing so, I will get 2x squared plus 7x minus 15 is equal to 0. Now I have a trinomial, so I need to factor this. So I will break it up into the two parentheses. Looking at the fact that my first term is 2x squared, the only way to get 2x squared is if one of my first terms is 2x and the other one is x. So I can for sure set those two values down for my first terms. Now my last terms have to multiply together to give me 15. Well, to get 15, I have two options. 1 times 15 or 3 times 5. I need to decide which of those two makes the most sense so that my outside and inside gives me a 7x. 3 and 5 makes the more logical sense here, so I'm going to work with 3 and 5 for my last two terms. Now keep in mind that our outside and our inside have to give us 7x. So it makes the most sense to take the 2 times the 5 and the 3 times the x, because 2 times 5 is 10x, 3 times x is 3x. And then if I take 10x minus 3x, I get my 7x. So then I can fill my signs in accordingly. So there I factored. Now that I've factored, I have 2x minus 3 times x plus 5 is equal to 0. So that means that one of those two values has to be 0. So I can create two equations now, and my two equations would be 2x minus 3 equals 0 and x plus 5 is equal to 0. Since they're being multiplied together to equal 0, that means one of the two must equal 0. Now I can solve them. So to solve 2x minus 3 equals 0, I'd add 3, so 2x is equal to 3. And then we would divide by 2, so x is equal to 3 halves. X plus 5 equals 0. To solve, I would subtract 5, so x is equal to negative 5. So my two solutions, written from least to greatest, would be negative 5 and then 3/2. We're going to do a couple more problems like this where we are solving by factoring. So x squared minus 16x plus 64 is equal to 0. Notice that this quadratic is already equal to 0, so there's nothing else we need to do before factoring. We can just factor it. So think about splitting it up into its two parentheses. Our first term is x squared, so it must be x times x. Our last term is 64, and we want our outside and our inside to give us a negative 16. So we need to think of our factors of 64 and what would work to give our outside and our inside a negative 16, and minus 8 would work for both spots. Negative 8 times negative 8 is a positive 64. Our outside is negative 8x. Our inside is negative 8x, and combining those we get the negative 16x. Now in this problem we have x minus 8 times x minus 8 is equal to 0. Notice that the factors are identical to each other, so that means our only option here for our solution is that x minus 8 is equal to 0. Well, if x minus 8 is equal to 0, that tells us that x should equal 8. So we just have one solution for this one. Let's look at one more for factoring. 6x squared plus 6 is equal to negative 13x. Well, we have to get this equal to 0, and we know we'd have to add the 13x to do that. But the question then becomes, where do we place that 13x in our quadratic? Recall we should always go from highest exponent to least, so we're going to put the 13x smack dab in the middle between the 6x squared and the 6. So we'd say 6x squared plus 13x plus 6 is equal to 0. Now that it's equal to 0, we can factor. So we can split this up into our two parentheses. Our first and our last terms here are both 6, so we want to think of the factors of 6. And the factors of 6 are 1 times 6 or 2 times 3. Now, which set of those factors would be the most logical to give us an outside and an inside of 13? 2 and 3 are. So we're going to work with 2x and 3x for our first terms. We'll also work with these for our last terms. And we want to think our outside and our inside needs to give us our 13x. So we want to take our 3 times our 3 and our 2 times our 2, because then we'd have 9 and 4. So I'm going to put my 2 on the outside location so that I multiply it by my other 2, and my 3 on the inside so I multiply it by my other 3, because now I have 4x plus 9x, and that does give us the 13. The other thing you should note here is that it would not make sense for the 2x plus 2 to be in the same parentheses, because that would have a GCF, and our original problem did not have one, so the factors of it should not either. So this tells us 2x plus 3 is equal to 0, and 3x plus 2 is equal to 0. Now we need to solve both of those. So if 2x plus 3 equals 0, that means 2x is equal to negative 3. Divide by 2, so x is equal to negative 3/2. If 3x plus 2 is equal to 0, we'd subtract 2, so 3x is equal to negative 2. Divide by 3, so x is equal to negative 2/3. So then writing from least to greatest, we'll put negative 3/2 first and negative 2/3 second. So there I solved. Now for the next two problems, I'm going to give you the solutions and we need to come up with the quadratic. So I'm going to give you the two answers to the quadratic, and from there we need to work backwards and get our starting quadratic equation with our something x squared plus something plus something. So we want to write an equation in quadratic form with the given roots. When we see the word roots, it just means solutions. So anytime you see the word roots, just think of it as solutions. It just means that those are our solutions to our quadratic. So for problem 6 here, our two roots, or our two solutions, are -2 and 7. So we're going to start off with exactly what that means. Those were the two values that our x could equal. So we're going to start off by saying x should equal -2 and x should equal 7. And now we're going to work backwards. So now we want both of these to be equal to 0. So x equals -2. To make this one equal to 0, I would add my 2 over. So I'd say x plus 2 is equal to 0. For x equals 7, to get this equation equal to 0, I would subtract my 7. So x is equal to x minus 7 is equal to 0. Now since these are both individually equal to 0, if I multiply them together, they should still equal 0. So x plus 2 times x minus 7 equals 0. And now I just have to FOIL this out or distribute it. So distributing my x times x is x squared. X times the -7 is minus 7x. Two times our x is a plus 2x. And then minus 14. So that gives us x squared minus 5x minus 14 is equal to 0 for our quadratic equation when we combined our outside and our inside together. So next up, our two solutions are 1/3 and 5. So that means that we're going to start off by saying x is equal to 1/3 and x is equal to 5. And once again, we want to make these both equal to 0. But consider x equals 1/3. If I just subtract a third, I'd have x minus a third equals 0. Typically when we factor things, we don't factor things into x minus a third. So we don't want fractions here. So I'm going to times by the denominator of 3 to get rid of my fraction. So I now have 3x equals 1. Now, to get this equal to 0, I would have to subtract 1 over. So I'd have 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. Doing a similar thing for x equals 5, to get this one equal to 0, I would subtract my 5. So x minus 5 is equal to 0. Now I'll times these two together. So I'll take 3x minus 1 and times it by x minus 5 and distribute throughout. So 3x times x is a 3x squared. 3x times minus 5 is a minus 15x. Minus 1 times x is a minus x. And minus 1 times a -5 is a plus 5. Now combining my like terms together, we would have 3x squared minus 16x plus 5 is equal to 0. And there we have written the resulting quadratic.